J.D. Vance brought a single folded piece of paper. He barely touched it. And by the time the evening was over, that document sitting quietly on a table had accomplished something that years of journalism, congressional hearings, and public pressure had failed to do. It forced a man who had built an entire political identity on the phrase, "I have seen the evidence," to sit in front of a live audience and produce absolutely nothing. Stay with me, because what unfolded inside that room goes far deeper than a single confrontation. This is about a pattern. A long, carefully constructed image that crumbled the moment someone asked the simplest possible question. Let's establish something first, because context is everything here. Adam Schiff didn't become one of the most prominent political figures of his generation by accident. He's sharp, disciplined, and for over 2 decades, he mastered the art of the controlled narrative. He understood television the way a conductor understands an orchestra. Every pause, every raised eyebrow, every carefully measured word placed for maximum effect. He knew how to project authority. He knew how to make accusations sound like certainties. And for years, that combination worked extraordinarily well. But there's a vulnerability built into that kind of brand, and it's a devastating one. When your entire political identity rests on being the careful one, the precise one, the official who only speaks from verified knowledge, you have just set the terms of your own accountability. You've handed anyone willing to press you a measuring stick. And the moment your actions don't match the standard you publicly claimed, there's nowhere to retreat. That's what made this night different from every other time Schiff had faced scrutiny. He wasn't being confronted by a hostile anchor fishing for ratings. He wasn't sparring with a partisan critic in a format he could dismiss. He was sitting 4 feet from a man who had done the homework, who wasn't interested in theater, and who had decided that the most lethal thing he could bring into the room wasn't an attack. It was a question. One simple, devastating question. The event was called Restoring Public Trust. The irony of that title was not lost on anyone who watched what followed. The venue was a hearing room inside the Dirksen Senate office building, and it was filled well beyond its designed capacity. Broadcast cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights glowing steadily. Journalists filled the overflow seating. And in the front row sat someone who hadn't come for the political spectacle, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who had driven several hours from Pennsylvania specifically for this night. His family had spent 18 months and a significant portion of their retirement navigating legal consequences that stemmed, at least in part, from claims that were repeated publicly as confirmed fact, claims that ultimately didn't hold up when the investigators finished their work. He wasn't angry anymore. That phase had passed. He sat in that front row with the quiet, worn-out patience of someone who had stopped expecting justice and had started simply hoping that one day, someone in that room would be asked to answer for what they'd said. He sat there with his hands folded in his lap, just waiting. On the panel, Schiff arrived with his usual composure, the practiced calm of a man who has spent decades in rooms like this and considers them his natural habitat. He settled into his chair, adjusted his suit jacket, and surveyed the audience with the kind of expression that communicates, before a single word is spoken, that he already knows how this ends. J.D. Vance sat down 4 feet away. Dark suit, unremarkable. No binders, no props, no visible preparation at all, except for a single piece of paper, folded once, resting face down on his leg. He didn't touch it. He just sat there. The host opened with standard remarks. The audience settled, and when the microphone passed to Schiff for his opening perspective on truth and institutional credibility, he took it the way someone takes a familiar tool they've used 1,000 times with comfortable ownership. What he said next lit the fuse on everything that followed. Schiff didn't ease into it. He leaned toward the microphone and, with the quiet confidence of a man who has never seriously doubted his own judgment, he turned and addressed Vance directly. He said, and this is important, because the precision of his own framing mattered enormously, that he was looking at someone who didn't understand how truth actually functions inside American institutions. A man from a small town, he said. A man who wrote a memoir, got into a good school, and decided that qualified him as an authority on facts, justice, and the mechanics of verification. He spoke about his own career as a model of caution. He said his legacy was built on one principle. He only ever confirmed what he had personally witnessed and verified. He would never get ahead of the facts. That discipline, he implied, was the very thing that separated serious people from performers. He sat back. He looked at his watch. The moment felt triumphant to him. He had no idea he had just handed Vance exactly what he needed. Vance didn't react. He didn't visibly bristle or smile or shift in his chair. He let the applause from Schiff's supporters ripple across the room and fade out naturally, And when silence returned, slightly longer and emptier than expected, he leaned toward his own microphone. His first word was "thank you," not the dismissive kind, not the condescending rhetorical kind. A genuine acknowledgement, delivered with enough sincerity that it momentarily disarmed the room. He said, that might be the most important thing said tonight, and he meant it because Schiff had just publicly committed himself on camera to a standard, a specific, clearly defined standard. He had declared himself a professional who only speaks on verified facts. He had called himself cautious. He had defined with his own words the bar by which his own conduct should be measured. And Vance, in that quiet, unhurried way, simply said, let's use that standard. Right here, right now, where everyone can see it. He said he was a simple man and wanted to start with something basic. Then he posed a question so elementary, so stripped of political jargon, that its simplicity was almost more stunning than any accusation could have been. You've said many times that you personally saw the proof. I want you to show us one piece of it, not 200. Just one. The auditorium didn't explode. It went quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight to it, the silence of several hundred people simultaneously recognizing that a very important thing had just been said. To understand why that question landed the way it did, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. Beginning in 2017, Schiff became one of the most prominent voices on a subject that consumed American political life for nearly 2 years. He appeared on television constantly. He gave interviews across every major platform. And during that period, he made a specific, repeated claim, not that something was under investigation, not that allegations deserved scrutiny, but that he had personally seen evidence of criminal coordination between a presidential campaign and a foreign government. He used the phrase more than circumstantial to describe what he'd witnessed. He repeated variations of that claim in excess of 200 times across multiple platforms over roughly 24 months. 200 times? When the special counsel's investigation concluded, it confirmed that foreign interference in the election was real. It confirmed that contacts occurred. But on the central claim, the specific active criminal conspiracy that Schiff had assured the public he had personally witnessed, the investigation could not and did not find sufficient evidence to support it. The careful professional who only spoke on verified facts had spent 2 years telling the country he had seen something that the nation's most comprehensive investigation couldn't locate. That's the math Vance was doing in that room. Quietly, patiently, with one folded piece of paper sitting untouched on his leg. Schiff's first instinct when the question registered was to pivot. It was fast, practiced, and for about 20 seconds it almost worked. He pulled the microphone close and shifted into a different register, not the conversational tone he'd been using, but the prosecutorial one. Louder, more emphatic. He said that what was happening on that stage was exactly the kind of political theater designed to punish people who do their jobs. He'd investigated a president. He'd done his constitutional duty while colleagues went quiet. He'd followed the evidence where it led, and now a surrogate for that same president was staging a public tribunal to make accountability look like the crime. He said he offered zero apologies for protecting the republic. He said history would judge him fairly. It was good. You have to give it that. It was a skilled performance, and it was designed to activate something in the audience, the instinct to extend the benefit of the doubt to someone invoking duty and sacrifice. Several journalists paused their note-taking. A few audience members nodded, and that's when the evening took its most unexpected turn, because the person who dismantled the pivot wasn't Vance. On the far end of the panel, an elderly man reached for his microphone. He'd been nearly motionless for the entire discussion, gray-haired, hands weathered, a voice like dry paper being turned slowly. He identified himself clearly, a registered Democrat, 3 decades as a federal prosecutor, no political sympathy for the figure being discussed. He said he had one point to make, and then he'd go back to being quiet. In 30 years inside courtrooms and grand jury rooms and federal proceedings, he said, there is an absolute rule. You do not stand up and tell 12 jurors, or the American public for that matter, that you have personally seen proof unless you are prepared to place that proof in front of them. That is the entire professional standard. That is the foundational ethical commitment. It has no exceptions for urgency, for political context, for the seriousness of the allegations. If you say I have seen it, you have to be able to show it. Then he turned and looked directly at Schiff. He said, a great many people in this country believed you. They trusted that a senior official with your security clearance and your institutional access would never use those words in public unless they were completely defensible. And when the investigation concluded without the central finding you'd guaranteed, those people weren't asking for perfection, They were asking for honesty. A professional can be wrong. That happens. What cannot survive, what no career in public life can outlast, is being deeply, fundamentally wrong, and then explaining to the people who trusted you that the problem was their gullibility for believing you in the first place. He put down his microphone. He didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. The permission to doubt that he had just granted the room was something Schiff's rhetorical defense couldn't reclaim. Because this wasn't a partisan critic, this wasn't an opposition operative. This was a Democrat, a career prosecutor, speaking from within the exact professional tradition Schiff had spent years claiming as his own. And he had said, plainly, what you did violated the standard. Vance took a sip of water. He set the glass down carefully, and in the silence that followed, that small sound carried across the room in a way that felt oddly final. He said, I want the record to reflect that I would have accepted an honest accounting early on. He meant it. Public figures get out ahead of stories. That happens on both sides, across every administration, in every era. He said he'd done it himself. He once told investors he'd reviewed legislation that was still being drafted. He owned it. He moved on. This, he said, was categorically different. He reached for the folded paper on his leg. He didn't open it yet. He just held it, drawing every eye in the room to it without saying a word about it. He said, in 2017, you didn't just make a statement in an interview. You went into a congressional session and you read materials into the congressional record. You understand what that means. The congressional record is the permanent archive of the United States government. It doesn't get corrected easily. It doesn't get deleted. What goes into it stays there, linked to your name, attached to history. And what you read into it was sourced from a dossier that its own handlers eventually had to retract. The document's primary source was subsequently indicted, not for the underlying allegations, but for lying to federal investigators. The intelligence agency that had initially engaged the dossier's compiler had previously cut ties with him over documented credibility concerns. By the time the materials were being read into the permanent record, significant red flags about the sourcing existed, and the cautious professional who only spoke on verified facts read them into history anyway, because the narrative had already been built. And the dossier fit the narrative. He paused. He said, when those facts emerged, when the source was charged, when the dossier collapsed, when reporters asked you directly whether you regretted what you'd put into the congressional record, you said your phrasing had been perfectly accurate. You said you'd do it again. Not an acknowledgement that the sourcing proved faulty. Not a recognition that the permanent record of the United States government now contained materials you'd sourced from a compromised origin. Just, I was right, I was careful, I stand by it completely. A long, still silence filled the room. That's not caution, Vance said quietly. I don't know what to call it exactly. But caution is what it isn't. Nobody laughed. This was past the point where laughter was the response. The room was doing something harder than laughing. It was reckoning. Because the layering of it was what made it so difficult to escape. It wasn't one bad interview. It wasn't one overstated claim. It was 2 years of repetition, a permanent record, a retracted source, and then, when given the opportunity to acknowledge any of it, a public statement saying, the problem was the audience's naivety for trusting what they'd been told. Schiff grabbed his microphone. His voice had changed, still controlled, still deliberate, but carrying something underneath it, now that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. He said Vance was criminalizing oversight. He said investigating wasn't illegal. He said the alternative to what he'd done was allowing power to operate without accountability, and he refused to accept that framing. He said history vindicated the bold, not the comfortable. Vance listened. He nodded slowly. He said, you're right that oversight is necessary. I agree completely. A functioning democracy needs people willing to press hard on power. So let me offer you the same grace I'd want if the situation were reversed. The investigation finishes. The central finding isn't there. A responsible official, a cautious professional, has a specific exit available. He steps forward and says, I pursued this aggressively because I believed it was critical. The investigation didn't confirm the conclusion I'd been communicating. The public deserves to know that, and they deserve my honesty about it. That's the exit. Every public figure gets one. Vance said he'd specifically reviewed what Schiff did during that window, not to confirm his assumptions, but because he wanted to be fair. He opened the folded paper. He smoothed it flat on the table in front of the cameras. Printed on it was one of Schiff's most repeated public statements, the one about more than circumstantial evidence, the one guaranteeing the existence of proof, placed directly alongside the concluding language from the special counsel's report. 2 texts, side by side, the claim and the finding that couldn't substantiate it. He didn't need to editorialize. He just left it there. He said, "You didn't take the exit. You went back on TV after the report dropped and told audiences that abundant evidence still existed, quote, in plain sight. That language came after the designated investigative body had published its findings. And when members of your own party quietly suggested you might have overextended, your response wasn't a course correction. It was an argument that the American people had become too accustomed to politicians who withheld information, implying, in other words, that the fault was theirs for taking you at your word." He shook his head slowly. "You were handed the one graceful exit a public figure gets," he said, "and you used it to tell the people who believed you that their trust was the problem." The sound that came from that audience wasn't outrage. It was something quieter and more permanent, the sound of an extended benefit of the doubt being finally, completely withdrawn. Not with anger, with exhaustion. Schiff's fingers moved toward his watch. He stopped himself. He put his hand flat on the table instead. He gathered himself and went for his final counterattack, and in fairness to him, it carried real emotional weight. He said, "Let's talk about courage. When that administration was working to reshape every institution in its image, when colleagues were afraid to say the name out loud, he stood in the chamber and said it directly. He was formally reprimanded for it. He told them that reprimand was an honor. He said he'd do every bit of it again tomorrow. He said Vance now occupied a position handed to him by the exact figure he'd spent years fighting, and being called reckless by that person's chosen representative told him everything he needed to know about whether he'd been right. It landed. For a moment, genuinely it landed. Because there was truth in it. The period he was describing was real. The pressure was real. The willingness to stay visible during an uncomfortable time was real. And for a few seconds, the room remembered that. Vance waited. He said softly, so softly the front rows leaned forward. "Nobody on this panel is disputing your willingness to stand up during a hard moment. Not me. I'd say that anywhere." He let that sit. "But that's not what tonight is about." He looked at the paper on the table. Then he looked at Schiff. He said, "There's something I want the people watching at home to understand clearly. And this matters especially because earlier tonight you characterized them. The working people, the ones who trusted your word, because they assumed an official with your access would never make those claims without being able to back them up. You characterized them as too emotionally reactive to distinguish fact from feeling. That's what you said, that they'd been manipulated by their own biases. This year," he continued, "federal investigators began examining whether the cautious professional who only deals in verified facts had simultaneously designated two separate properties, one in Maryland, one in California, as his primary residence. Each designation was made to a different government entity. Each designation offered a different financial benefit, a reduced mortgage rate on one, a preferential tax classification on the other. Two houses. One signature. Two separate claims that each property was the exclusive primary residence, made at the same time to different agencies, by the same person." The room went completely still. He said, "The people you called too naive to process the truth go to one bank. They sign one mortgage. For the one house they actually live in. And they're watching a man who lectured them about the sophistication required to handle complex evidence, navigate a federal inquiry into whether he legally claimed two houses as one house at the same time. He didn't raise his voice once during any of that. A junior aide appeared at the edge of the stage, moving quickly and carefully, leaning down to deliver a message into Schiff's ear before sliding a folded note onto the table beside him. Schiff didn't look at the note. He kept his eyes on Vance. But the people in the first 3 rows watched the aide's face. It was the specific expression of someone delivering information that cannot wait until a better moment. The note sat there, sealed, next to an untouched glass of water for the rest of the evening. Schiff did what he had always done when cornered. He reached for the prosecutorial register. His voice sharpened. His posture stiffened. He said Vance was calling oversight a crime. He said the alternative to holding power accountable was allowing it to operate in darkness. He said he'd built his career on following evidence, and he wasn't going to apologize for that now. On this stage, to this opponent, Vance said, "I've already agreed with you on oversight. We're past that point." He said, "Your institution, the one you say you protected, took a formal vote in 2023. The result was 213 to 209. And the specific language they attached to your name in the official record was that you had intentionally misled the American people." He paused. Not a partisan pundit's characterization, not an opposition research document, not a campaign attack. The formal judgment of the body you claim to have served, inscribed permanently in its proceedings, using the word misled. He said, "You've talked tonight about permanent records. Your name appears in 2 of them, once next to the unverified materials you submitted, once next to the word that your own institution chose." The low rolling sound that moved through the room at that moment wasn't applause. It wasn't even exactly audible in the way a reaction is audible. It was more like a collective exhale, the sound of something that had been suspended for a long time, finally coming to rest. "Vance wasn't finished," he said. "I want to explain something about where I learned what I know about truth. Not from a classroom, not from a policy briefing. I served as a military correspondent in a combat zone. My job was documentation. That's all it was. Going to places, witnessing things, and then describing exactly what I had witnessed. Nothing more, nothing less. And the rule, the only rule that mattered, the rule that was drummed into every person who did that work, was that you never write a word you didn't personally see. Because people read it. People at home, far away from what's actually happening, trust the reporting. They make decisions based on it. If you write something you only hoped was true, and someone reads it and makes a decision based on your hope, and that decision costs them something real, you carry it permanently." He looked at Schiff. He said, "I didn't learn the mechanics of truth from a textbook or a career in law. I learned them in places where being wrong had immediate, irreversible consequences. You said tonight that I don't understand how truth works in this republic. What I understand is that you do not publish what you haven't witnessed. That's not ideology. That's not partisanship. It's the only rule that ever actually mattered, and it's the rule that was broken 200 times over 2 years by the person in this room describing himself as the careful one." He stopped talking. He didn't call Schiff a liar. He never used that word. He never called him corrupt, dishonest, or fraudulent. He simply placed the things Schiff had said next to the things the investigation had found, let them share the same space, and let the distance between them speak. "I never sold a story I couldn't support," he said. "That's the only kind of ignorance worth naming tonight. And the Marine isn't the one who's guilty of it." Adam Schiff looked at his wrist. He had done it repeatedly throughout the evening, a habit so persistent and unconscious that the people in the front rows had started counting. A man conditioned to running out the clock. A man whose career had been built on controlling the room until the broadcast ended and the moment passed. But this time something different happened. He reached down and unclasped the watch. He set it on the table beside the open document, beside the 2 texts, side by side, the claim and the finding. And he sat there with both hands empty, and his mouth slightly open, searching for the start of a sentence that never came. The host leaned toward her microphone and asked, gently, if the senator wished to respond. He didn't answer. What came through the sound system instead was a sharp burst of audio feedback, a piercing, metallic squeal that cut through the silence of that room, the way a car alarm cuts through a quiet street at 3 in the morning. It was jarring. It was involuntary, and in the context of everything that had just happened, it felt less like a technical malfunction and more like punctuation. The senator, who had assured the country more than 200 times that he had personally seen the proof, sat in front of a live audience and a bank of broadcast cameras and said absolutely nothing. By the time the building's corridors were emptying, the clip was already moving. Someone had cut the sequence precisely, the repeated public assurances, the demand for a single piece of evidence, the moment the watch came off, and posted it without commentary. It didn't need any. Within hours, the footage was the dominant conversation on every platform. But here's the thing that should be noted carefully, because it explains why this moment had the impact it did. The public wasn't debating foreign policy. They weren't arguing about congressional oversight, or the conclusions of the special counsel's report, or the finer points of intelligence classification. Those debates had been ongoing for years, and people had long since chosen their sides on those questions. What the public was watching, rewinding, sharing, commenting on, was something much simpler. An official who had said, "I have seen it over and over and over again," sitting in a room where someone finally said, "Then show us one piece of it," and having nothing to produce. No classified briefing he could reference. No carefully worded deflection about the nature of intelligence work. No procedural reason the evidence couldn't be named. Just silence and a watch placed on a table, and the particular kind of political mortality that sets in when a narrative finally exhausts itself. The anger, it turned out, had already burned away. What was left wasn't fury. It was something quieter and more final, the collective decision by a very large number of people to simply stop extending the benefit of the doubt. In one of the building's marble-floored corridors, a journalist caught a Democratic congresswoman who had publicly endorsed Schiff multiple times. The Congresswoman asked not to be identified. She looked down the hallway in both directions before speaking. She said, "We all knew inside. Not that he was lying exactly, but that the certainty had gotten ahead of the evidence. We told ourselves it was intensity, that he had access we didn't, that maybe he knew something classified that he couldn't say directly." She paused. "You can survive being wrong in this business. What you cannot survive is being asked to produce a single item, one thing, after 200 guarantees, and the only thing you can find to do with your hands is take your watch off." She moved away before the recorder was fully raised. The man from Pennsylvania drove home in silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He just drove, watching the highway markers pass in his headlights, somewhere in that stretch of interstate between the city and the state line where you can go 30 minutes without seeing another car, and somewhere in that stretch alone in a dark car with no audience, no cameras, and no one watching. He started to laugh. He laughed at the image of a man removing his watch because he had run out of words. He laughed because for 18 months, his family had lived inside the aftermath of claims that 200 public guarantees had made seem unquestionable. Claims that no one had ever been required to actually defend until one evening. In a building he'd driven hours to reach, a man with one piece of paper had asked the question and waited. He laughed for a long time. And then he drove the rest of the way home. J.D. Vance left without lingering. That too was deliberate, or at least it felt that way. He didn't stand at the edge of the stage accepting congratulations. He didn't field questions from the reporters calling his name as he moved through the corridor. He shook 2 or 3 hands, moved efficiently toward the exit, and was gone before the room had fully processed what it had witnessed. He passed the empty chair where a certain senator had sat. He passed the table where a folded document and an unclasped watch remained, left behind like evidence of something that had already concluded. He had walked into the room with one piece of paper. He walked out with it still in his jacket pocket. Here's what this evening was really about, and it matters beyond the political identities of the two people involved. There is a specific kind of public credibility, the credibility built on the claim of superior access, superior caution, superior rigor, the implicit promise that when this person says something, they've done the verification work, so you don't have to. It's an appealing offering in an information-saturated world. It's also an extraordinarily fragile one, because it rests entirely on the assumption that the claims will eventually be shown to be true. When they're not, when the investigation concludes, or the document is retracted, or the source is indicted, a very specific accountability becomes available. And if it's not met honestly, if the response is to insist on accuracy while dismissing the people who trusted the original claim, that credibility doesn't just erode, it inverts. The person who promised careful verification becomes the example of exactly what they claim to oppose. That's what the watch on the table represented. Not a political defeat, not a partisan victory. The specific end of a specific narrative, played out on a stage large enough for everyone to see. The greatest debaters, the most effective people in any high-stakes confrontation, rarely win by being louder, faster, or more aggressive. They win by understanding the terrain before the other person does, by recognizing which commitments have been made publicly and how to return to them at the right moment, by asking the question that was always there, that everyone was always thinking, that no one had yet required to be answered directly. What did you see? Can you show it to me? Just one piece. After 200 times. Just one. It was the question a child would ask. It was the question everyone in that room had been carrying for years. And the reason it finally landed the way it did, definitively, irrevocably, without any rhetorical maneuver capable of softening the impact, was that it was asked calmly by someone sitting still, holding a single piece of paper, who had the patience to wait for an answer that never came. Silence, it turns out, is a more honest answer than anything that could have been said. The note on the table was never opened, the watch was never put back on, and 200 guarantees remained exactly what they had been for years, before anyone had the presence of mind to simply ask for one. Unverified, unsubstantiated, and now permanently unanswered. If this reached something in you, if you've ever watched someone build a reputation on certainty they couldn't back up and wondered when the accounting would come, share this with someone who needs to see it. Because the most powerful question in any room full of confident claims is still the simplest one. Show me. Just one piece. And sometimes the loudest answer is the sound of a watch being placed on a table.